Well, let's transition here. You've got I guess you can still say, relatively new book out here. It's called Cope.
There you go.
Your second book after the JD book here. I've got the original
Yes.
on the wall behind me here, and the re-release that came
Oh, you
out
got the second
a
edition. Right
few
on.
days later as well. So again, I know that this took a little bit longer than you were anticipating, and through no fault of your own, really, with the whole deal with StarCom Racing, which you have, of course, delayed the release of the book to make sure it was accurately covered here. But correct me if I'm wrong. I think you pretty much started working on that as soon as the original edition of JD was finished, and it took 5 years for that project to finally come to fruition. So, what was the process like from start to finish of meeting with Derek and putting all the interviews together and making sure all that was covered in the book?
For sure. It was, it was a very different experience for the JD book for sure. I mean, you mentioned right off the bat. I mean, the biggest difference is, of course, Cope is with us, and very much so, still active in motorsports even today, after the closing of StarCom Racing, and having the person available, it kind of has its own share of challenges. With JD, it was almost like writing, like it was almost like trying to solve a mystery, because this driver was, JD was one of the shyest. I mean, a lot of people say he was either shy or bashful. Very much kept to himself, very committed to his work. Did do a share of interviews, and they had a number of people that covered him, and you had to use a lot of secondary sources to kind of figure him out, and it was very dependent on interviews from as many different people as possible to come close to understanding who he was. Now, I think even at the end of that, I'm not sure how successful that was, because I think that, without talking to the man himself and asking him, questions about his motivation or anything, I think that it's still not the most complete picture you can get. I think that's probably just unknowable at this point. But with Derek, I mean, yeah, it's been fantastic. Uh, we, you're correct that in 2018, we did the media tour for the JD book. It came out in July of that year. We did the media tour in Watkins Glen, and by the time we came back from the Glen, I was talking with the folks. I was thinking the next book was actually going to be the field fillers. I had already done some research on that, and I was putting something together, and it just wasn't going anywhere. And I was like, I couldn't figure out why this wasn't going anywhere. And then eventually, it occurred to me, it's like, wait a minute, this shouldn't be a book. This should be a video series. I'm just transcribing what's happening in videos. Why don't I just show the video clips, and these people are around? I can talk to them. And then that's, of course, where the video series came from. So once that happened, it's like, okay, well, okay, I still like to do another book, but what should the subject be? And Derek Cope came up, because he was the first driver I got an autograph from, at the Sonoma Raceway in 1992. I even before I really knew who the drivers were in the field, just when I was a kid, seeing Days of Thunder for the first time when I was 8 years old. I loved the paint scheme on the Purelator car, that rocket red with the white, seeing it in diecast. I remember, my brother and I were collecting diecast, and I traded him for that. Yeah, he liked Terry Labonte, and I was liking Cope's car, and that was my kind of my open door into the sport. I'd always been kind of into, um, the well, this is kind of a silly comparison, but it's true, so I'll just say it. I grew up with Thomas the Tank Engine, as a kid, and I remember collecting the diecast from that, and that was the great
Same
thing with
here.
it. It's like, yeah. Oh, you too?
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah. So
I
yeah, it was
think I
always
still
like,
have a couple bins of them back in my childhood home in Delaware. But yeah,
there you go.
same here.
Okay. I can never tell. I know Unlucky Tug and other channels are still doing really great stuff with that. And so I can never tell how big something is culturally in one way or the other. But yeah, that was just the frame rate. I mean, frame reference for me. It's like, okay, number one is Thomas, it's blue. Number three is Henry, and it's green. And it was very much like that with the diecast in NASCAR. It's like, okay, number 10 is, bright orange or red, and it's Purelator. And then it was always the cars, and then learning about the drivers afterwards. And Cope was part of that, unknowingly, but I mean, that just kind of was the case. And yeah, he signed my Mouse hat in 1992, and yeah, he's probably the first driver I followed. Then I didn't understand team and driver changes at the time. I remember in '94 when Rudd started his own team. He ran an orange car with different sponsorship. I assumed it was the same team, and I just started following Ricky Rudd at that point, and that was before Jerry Nadeau. Jerry Nadeau was really the first driver I followed that actually followed him in his career and really followed him for the driver, not really for the car he ran and stuff. But that, obviously that's a whole different story. But with Derek was, kind of really very, beginning of that. I think I'd always kind of kept an eye out for whatever car Derek was racing, whether it was the Bahari team or, Yarborough's team or Bobby Allison. And, much like JD was just kind of a figure that always popped up here and there in my research. For example, just like with JD, Derek Cope did have a number of last place finishes. I believe he had the record in the Cup Series after JD's passing and before Michael McDowell climbed up the rankings. At least he did for it. Might have been all three series combined because I think disproportionately it was some from the Xfinity series. But he always stayed in the sport, and I was always very impressed with his how professional his demeanor was. Still is today. Wearing a suit to autograph sessions. You see that clip of him going out to being on the David Letterman show after winning the Daytona 500. And that was very purposeful. His father raised him, say, look, you may or may not be a great race car driver, but you got to be great outside the car too. You got to market yourself well. You got to be just cognizant of your image at all times. And he's, but he's like that. But at the same time, also, one of the most friendly guys you'll ever talk to, still is. But also one of the most determined competitors you would ever see, and it's no accident that he ended up in the second spot at the last lap of that Daytona 500, and really, over time in trying to find a good story to follow up with JD. I mean, that was kind of the thought. It's like, well, I'd had an interest in Derek, haven't really done as much research on his career so much as I had with JD, but really try to really understand what got Derek into that moment where he was there. I mean, what was Bob Whitcomb Racing? What was his deal with Purelator? Buddy Parrott being the crew chief. I mean, all these pieces had to come together. And then what happened afterwards? Why isn't Whitcomb Racing, for example, around now? What was Purelator's role in the sport after that time period? And so forth. And so yeah, really at that point, that was kind of the starting point for writing the book. And to answer your question about interviewing him, I mean, we had, other than the autograph thing, and then that was just over a fence at the infield at Sears Point. We never spoke face to face, even in my media stuff. I don't believe I had interviewed him before. But I reached out to him and his wife Alicia, and I think it was before Phoenix. We had arranged something before Phoenix to do an interview. And I mean, she was immediately on board. She was very supportive of the project right from the beginning. I think Derek was as well, but I think Derek wanted to know what my intentions were. And I certainly understand that. Again, somebody being very mindful of his image, certainly understandable. Kind of a similar experience I had with Stanton Barrett in the field fillers deal. But we did a first interview. Um, I I probably shouldn't have led off with asking about the baseball injury, but I couldn't help because I thought that was kind of my earliest understanding of his career. But he was very upfront about it. I mean, he talked about that. And, I wanted to offset that by kind of talking more about, good times in the sport and all that and what got him into racing. Cause that was, it's like, okay, what was that transition? How do you go from trying to be a baseball prospect into racing? That first step really, what was that? And that's where, yeah, he started to kind of open up more about his father's career, the engine shop, how they had built engines for drivers like Chuck Bound that were racing in the West Series, and how that kind of opened some opportunities with some West Series team owners like George Jefferson and so forth. And yeah, I mean, that was kind of the starting point. We had I think we talked for probably 45 minutes or so during that weekend. I think it was during like the start of the Xfinity race that weekend there. I remember he had it on the TV in the corner there, and we were just talking. We just, it went past the start of the race. I think it went longer than we thought it were going to, but that was a good sign. I didn't want to stop it there, and I was like, okay, well, hey, we'll keep this going. And then we did some follow up interviews later on when, luckily, Starcom was, they just started and they were finishing their first full time season in 2018 when we did the first interview. And then we did some follow up ones 2019. I think even 2020, right before the pandemic, I talked to him at Fontana. And yeah, we just did piece by piece. We talked about Daytona. We talked about this. And and it was a little easier to get other people that they knew because luckily, again, Derek, I think, has been so successful with um, the way he approached his career. I don't think he burned bridges with anybody. Like, I think he had some team owners that, things fell apart, like the Cale Yarborough deal or something like that. But I don't think even he was on bad terms with Yarborough after that. I didn't get that sense. And pretty much anybody that sponsored him is has always been in the Rolodex, whether it was Purelator or Bojangles or Mane and Tail. So that's why when he was at Premium Motorsports later in his career, you saw him bring those sponsors back. That wasn't just a figurehead. He actually had the same guy he could call and they jump right back on board. And that was a big part of his career and still is today, even with what they're doing in the TCR series here in sports car racing. So, that was, and so it was different from JD because now Derek was providing all these different contacts, and I just talked to him, like whether it was Buddy Parrott or the folks over at Purelator and so forth. And um I had my own research on top of it to kind of get the statistical side of it and some of the other news stories. Because that's the other thing. I think the other reason that Derek was a little bit skeptical of what I was doing at the start was he deliberately avoided like anything like, I mean, he was always great with the media, wouldn't refuse photos or anything like that, but he wouldn't like read up on like articles about him or stuff like that. He didn't really care about any of stuff like that. So because he didn't want to get hung up in like, anything that was negative. And I'm sure that that helped him in, how long he stayed in the sport. But we crossed that threshold pretty quick. I think, once I told him about the JD book and how that went, we were on good terms from there, and I feel like still are now. We're still hoping to do some book signings here going forward. I don't have anything. I wish I had something to announce on your show here. We don't have anything set yet, but hopefully we will. If not this year, certainly next year. So we're kind of working on things like that. But been a great experience, very positive experience. And I don't currently plan on working on another book right now. I'm kind of focusing more on the videos at the moment to kind of leave room to promote this one. But it was a very enjoyable experience. I'm happy to have done a book where it was very different from. It was similar to JD in some ways, but very different in others. I wanted to definitely do a driver that had won in the Cup Series before, for one thing. Preferably a driver that was still with us that I could talk to directly and be part of the marketing in it. Yeah, Derek was very high on that list, and I'm glad. I could tell, from the response they had that they very much enjoyed the book and sharing it with their relatives and everything over the holidays. I'm glad we got it out before the holidays there, so they were able to celebrate that, and that was good to see.
So just to, I guess, prove how insane it is how things can come full circle sometimes. I remember, and I think again we talked about this last time we were on, but the first Cup race that I ever watched was 2006 Fall Talladega, and so
There we go.
Derek's name has been in my mind ever since I watched my first race because as a fan of the underdogs, I saw the driver who both started and finished last in that number 74 McGlynn car. So I've always kind of had an eye on his career ever since I became a race fan as well. And certainly being intrigued in recent years by him coming back into the Cup Series with premium and then getting the background from what you wrote in the book on how the whole StarCom racing deal came together. So what stood out to me, I guess, is there's always kind of been in the whole charter agreement, and that conversation is something that I think we should probably save for another day because that deserves a much deeper dive here. But there's always been that clause that if your charters in the bottom three of the chartered entries in the standings for 3 years in a row, that NASCAR that is can remove or revoke your charter. And thinking about some of the other smaller teams in the sport, and Rick Ware's history, and Rick Ware I think has a team that is certainly finally starting to take that next step, which is great to see. But I didn't realize until I read your book that StarCom Racing was really in that position where it wasn't their choice, it wasn't something that they wanted to do, but from a financial standpoint they basically had no choice but to sell off their charter. So I imagine again that must have been a difficult conversation to have and ultimately led to the delay of the books that you could include that in the story. But what were those conversations like, having started the book process and then having that whole turn be taken again out of your control and having to alter, the release schedule and everything, and finishing putting the book together? What was that like?
That's a very good point. Yeah, I'd overlooked that. That was the the process. I had no idea, certainly starting that book, that it was going to be about like the life cycle of Starcom Racing. I was hoping that by the end of it, it would be, okay, Starcom Racing is still in the cups. I had like a whole ending there. I had a quote from Derek that was going to fit in there, and like, the Starcom Racing team is now in the next gen era, and they're looking to close the gap on everybody else. And sadly, just wasn't meant to be there. And the it certainly was challenging. I think those were definitely the two most challenging parts of finishing the book. There was certainly, for one, the closing of Starcom, as you mentioned there, but also Derek returning to the Daytona 500 and running that one-off race there, where just nothing went right the entire week. And then on top of it, there was a family tragedy there with Derek's I believe it was their his father-in-law passing away there that weekend. And so it was just a rough deal on all fronts there that weekend. But that's, I think that was probably, for writing a book, like that's really kind of the challenging part. You have I try to have some kind of an ending in mind, but this one here, it's like, okay, it's like different stuff just kept happening. It's like, well, we're gonna have to cover this and we're gonna have to cover that. The thing with the charter deal was just really just shocking, really. I mean, I really, I think the biggest thing that I wanted to convey in that, especially given the fact that, by the time the book, certainly by the time the book came out, Starcom was not only closed, but I mean, everything had been auctioned off, really. I felt that there was an opportunity there to, clear, um, give a clear, message as to what was happening with that team, what was and what wasn't. Because I think it's very easy to, not everybody looks at the back of the field the way you and I do here. With these teams, I remember distinctly when Quinn Half wrecked at Phoenix in that last start. There was somebody else in the media center was like, well, there's a fitting end to that team. And it's just like, look, I mean, it's like, hey, as far as I know, a team out there, if they qualify a car, if they passes inspection, they have just as much a right to be out there as anybody. And if they finish last 8 times in a row, well, that happens. Then the next time they're going to still try to beat somebody else the next week there. And they were not nearly that bad, but they were in a position where potentially they were going to lose that charter. And according to the Copes, they were told in no uncertain terms, with months to go left in the season, that if they were in that bottom three again, they were going to lose that charter and they were not going to be able to be paid any amount to it. NASCAR was just going to straight take it. And they were very adamant about that. And right up to the end, they didn't want to go. And then, to add insult to injury, when the charter was being sold to 2311 through Spire, through the Spire Group, by the way, they were under a non-disclosure thing. They couldn't talk about it. So going into Phoenix, which turned out to be their last start, they didn't really have any other like guests or anything with them. It was pretty much just the team itself. I mean, I didn't see any, I didn't really look to see if there was anybody sitting atop the pit box there with them. But if they had a guest list, it looked like it was very short, because they would have only, I think they were only able to really reveal that this was like their last start within like days of that Phoenix race. And they were just so upset. I mean, Alicia in particular, I think, took it very hard. And because I mean, it was a thing that they started on their own, and they worked their tails off there and tried to develop a program. And they wanted to do the best they could, and obviously they would have loved to finish better than they did. But there was a progression there. They brought different sponsors on there, including sponsors that had worked with Derek in the past. And I think that, and that was the most surreal thing, and I mentioned it in the book too. That wreck that Quinn had happen. They loaded the car up, and Alicia and Derek were there watching it. And then right after that, we went to the parking lot right on the other side of the track over in turns 1 and 2. And they gave me the next copy of the manuscript for the book with Derek's notes in it. Even then, it's like, well, that's the end of one chapter. And here's our notes on this one. We'll add this into the next part of it. And then we went over that. So, I think it was a very raw experience, and to see that firsthand, I felt like, well, as I said, with 500 days, I mean, you witness history. I mean, history doesn't have to be a big earth shattering moment. It could be something, maybe that would have been completely overlooked or just underreported, something like that. And I felt like, okay, this has to be in the book. And, it's going to be towards the end, and we're going to have to really kind of work it in there. And I don't want to end it on a down note, for sure. But it has to be as honest as possible. And, I would have loved to get other context on it, about what was going on in the charter negotiations. Uh, but at that point, it's like, look, this is their story, and I take them at their word, and this is what happened. And I think it was important to share that in there. So, it's unfortunate. I hate that things shook out that way, but it was important to share it. It was important to have that in there. And again, it's not the end of the story either. I think just this week they even have like another promo for, I guess they're running Sebring here pretty soon, or some kind of deal of that nature. So they're going to be, running with the Starcom branding on it again, which has its own story. If your viewers haven't checked out the book yet, I won't spoil that, because I think that connection that the Starcom folks and the Copes have is, I think, a really interesting story too. But it was challenging. I mean, to kind of answer your question, it was definitely, I'd say, to offset like kind of the equivalent. It was at least as challenging to kind of cover that part of the story as it was in the JD book to cover talking about the accident and the investigation and so forth. So I didn't anticipate that this story would have that aspect, but as following, things that happened in last place, for example, or just, articles you and I write on the website, you, myself, and William as well. Sometimes, it could be a more serious situation. You think of Jordan Anderson with the fire he had at Talladega a couple of years ago. This was very much that equivalent. But again, I hope I did it justice on that. I'm not, looking to, smear anybody or anything like that with the story. But I think, the more you listen to any of these stories of drivers and teams from any time period, people get their toes stepped on and stuff like that happens. And I'm still working my way through Dominic Aragon's book on Jeff Bodine as well. And my understanding is it's already very interesting on that one too. I've been very much enjoying that. So hopefully there's going to be more stories like this coming up, if not from me, from others as well.
Yeah, and again, I look at how that story ended, and it almost seems like, from what you write in the book and what the Copes shared, that, it's kind of like the quiet part being spoken out loud about how difficult or virtually impossible it is for, an independent like that to make it in the Cup Series today, and much less, run competitively alongside the Hendricks and Penske's of the world, which is obviously in stark contrast to 30 plus years ago when Derek won the Daytona 500. And, just again, from my perspective, just a shame to see that as somebody who's, like yourself, a fan of the smaller teams. And, I guess you still kind of have those independents in Xfinity and trucks, but certainly a rarity if it's not gone entirely from the Cup Series.
Yeah, it is. It's unfortunate. I actually have another opinion video I'm working on here that kind of address that subject as well. That may elaborate on. It's hard for me to churn out opinion context sometimes, because I always seem like I work on that, and then it's like, well, is this really what I'm thinking, or is this just kind of like, is this the most fair way to assess this or something else? But I don't know. I always second guess a lot of my opinion stuff when I'm working on it. But yeah, I mean, I think, definitely in terms of the small teams in the sport, I've always, the thing that's bugged me the most about it, and I think I've said it on the streams before as well. I've never understood what threat the small teams always seem to have for the big teams. And I have to always think that, because it always seems like when some new rule change comes in, or when it's some new advance in technology or whatever it is, it always seems like it's like, oh, this will get rid of the small teams, and we'll just be able to, have our own deal. I mean, the charter system couldn't be more transparent in that sense there to literally pick 36 people out of 43 plus different teams that are out there and say, you guys get to keep going and you guys are picking with the chickens. And it's not the only example of it. And I think in Derek Cope's story, you kind of see that trajectory. I mean, really, despite the fact that he won the Daytona 500, even then, even after winning the 500, Bob Wickham Racing was not a top flight organization. It was not one of the big teams out there. They had a deal where they ran Hendrick engines, and that was one piece of the puzzle. It wasn't the only reason they won. Buddy Parrott was a massive part of it, and then Derek's driving skills on top of it. But it was, and well, Robert G as well in terms of, putting the car together. But yeah, Derek in his entire career never drove for a top flight team. He never drove for Roush. He never drove for Yates. He never had those kind of deals. And he had to make do with what he had. And you look at today and drivers coming up through the ranks, thankfully we've seen just recently with like Raja Karuth winning the Vegas Truck Series race and getting this deal with Spire and Hendrick support, of course, driving the Hendrick Xfinity car at Phoenix last year. And we also saw Josh Berry, of course, getting into the Cup Series now by way of Junior Motorsports effort and the chances that were taken on him. But depending on what you have access to or what your background is or anything, there's how many opportunities are out there. And it used to be the small teams were the way to have that happen. Junie Donlavey, for example, was one of the best examples of somebody that always seemed to take a chance on new and inexperienced drivers. I didn't think talk about Stanton Barrett that much on this episode, but he did too. He and his father both raced for Junie Donlavey at one point, which is pretty incredible. I mean, it just shows how long in the sport they were, every bit as much as the Wood brothers or the Petties or anything. But we don't have that. As you mentioned, we have an Xfinity in trucks, which is great. We have programs that have brought in new and exciting and entertaining personalities, whether it's a Steve Malazzi or Brayton Laster or any of these other guys, Brad Perez, any number of these drivers that come into there. But to get into the Cup Series, there's only so many chess pieces on that board, and they got to move in just the right pattern at just the right time nowadays to let someone in there. And there's always been that aspect to it, but it's always been like a couple of tiers that there'd always be like this backup where maybe you drive for somebody like TriStar Motorsports or Donlavey or anything. And I think that, there's a bit of a log jam there that's happening, which is unfortunate. While you're always going to have some drivers, stay in the Xfinity series or the truck series for a long time, like a Randy LaJoy or Frank Kimmel in the ARCA series or something of that nature. At least let it be by choice. They should have like the option to make that step. And I'm not saying I'm not for entitlements in the sport, particularly for the big teams because they don't need them. But I think that on the other end there, people should be given the opportunity to earn their position in there. And I think in the Cup Series right now, that opportunity realistically doesn't really exist.
Yeah, well, I guess to bounce off that, I guess it doesn't exist in Formula One either, because you look at Andretti trying to come in, and I mean, again, you want to talk about the complete opposite of a small team or a small name. I mean, I don't know if there is a bigger name in the world of motorsports than Andretti, and their entry being denied by Formula One. So what does that say about the exclusivity of F1 coming out publicly and saying we have room on the grid for up to 12 teams or whatever it is. We could fit that on the grid if we wanted to, but Michael Andretti comes out with a perfectly good entry here that I think and again who would have known until we actually would see them out on the track, but I think an entry that has their feet underneath them much more than the HRTs and Caterhams and Virgins of the world in 2010, and concerns about them not being competitive or not being able to make a name for themselves or whatever the excuse was. I just think is absolutely ridiculous, even more so than what's going on in NASCAR right now with the charters.
No, exactly. Exactly. I mean, again, goes right back to it's like what is the threat of these small teams? I am of a mind that it's like, look, it's a competition. It's a competition, not just between drivers, it's a competition between teams. It's a competition between money, competition between assets, competition in every sense of the term. There's so much equipment at stake, so much money at stake, so much pride at stake. Look, I mean, I scoff at any of these things where you have somebody that presents an opportunity that's actively interested in competing, that's jumping through every hoop that's out there. Hoops, mind you, that many of which these other teams that have been there for years probably never had to deal with at the outset. And now they're jumping through it and then they still don't get declined. It's like, no, no, no. It's like, look, if you're threatened by these teams, compete against them. Compete. Show them that they're not worthy. If they're not worthy to you, then you better step up your business and make sure that you beat them. Because if they catch you sleeping and these guys pull off a Braun 2009 thing and starts stomping down your throat on that, it's like, well, whose fault is that? It's like, well, that's your fault. That's your fault for not rising to the occasion and competing with them. And it's not, oh, your failure to prevent them from getting on the grid and embarrassing you. It's like, no, 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 no. You have to compete. That's what I've always liked with big fields is it keeps the big teams honest. And you have competition and competition at every level, whether it's just to qualify for race. I'm thinking of this more in a NASCAR context. I mean, I know we're well past the pre-qualifying era in Formula One, but yeah, I mean, having a large field of taking on all comers, and if they, if a team that doesn't have a sponsor out qualifies a car that has tons of sponsorship and was signed for the full year, and the sponsor wanted to run a full year, well, that's not the guy that qualified's fault. That's your guy's fault for not being fast enough. Even if it was just a mistake or something else that happens. I mean, that could happen just as easily to anybody. I don't get the threat about not letting in more teams. We're seeing it's spreading. It's spreading from this charter system in the Cup Series, and I mean, it was suggested in the IndyCar series. Thankfully, at least from the last discussions I heard, it sounded like it was getting at least laughed at. Formula One, they basically have, I mean, it sounds like it's if it's not an outright charter system, their treatment of the Andretti thing certainly it's certainly like saying, no, we're full up. We're not going to have anybody else in there. To not, you did a great job in your opinion piece there on the Andretti deal, and I share the frustrations. It's insane. You have the Andretti name. It's like when somebody says Andretti, you think speed. You think if somebody cuts you off in traffic and somebody shouts at him and says, "What do you think you are, Mario Andretti?" Everybody knows what that means. You don't have to explain it. To not want that in your sport, in any sport, is crazy. I'd say, yeah. I mean, if I were Formula One, I'd be head over heels wanting them in there. I'd say, okay, yeah, you get in the back of the grid. We'll give you the high. I mean, I guess they don't do the car number by points position anymore, but I mean, like, we'll give you the furthest. We'll give you the Andrea Moda spot back in the garage area here, and yeah, and then we'll see if you compete. And I'll tell you what, if they're worried about ratings, that'll bump those up right away, because people, I think that's one of those things that's universal. People want to see what they can do. Have you had a chance, if you don't mind me asking you,
Sure.
doing the universal here? Have you seen the documentary that was done on the Andrea Moto series? I think it was on. It's in Italian, so you watch it like in subtitles there. But I watched that over the off season here, and it was very interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
I haven't seen the one you're talking about. I think Josh Rebel did a couple of videos on
okay,
that whole saga and everything. So I'm a little familiar with the story, but
it's
not
very
not
good.
yeah, not a, haven't seen that one, I don't think.
Yeah, it's very good. I think you'll find, especially from the back of the field, and like again keeping these teams out. I think if that wasn't really the start, I mean, my Formula One history grasp. I mean, I got spots of it here, but I don't have it entirely. I like watching mobile chicane and Aiden Millward and stuff, and kind of using that to kind of fill the gaps in a bit. Yeah, it's really well done. It talks a lot about the team itself, kind of clearing up some of the misconceptions about this team, and really what the effect on the sport has been since then. 'Cause this is like 1992 is when I believe this story was dated, 91, 92, in that time period, and what the sport was like before then and what it was like after. I think you'll see a lot of comparisons to kind of pre-charter system, post-charter system in the Cup Series there. At least it felt that way to me. Even with the language barrier, it still came across. Like, I mean, again, it's in subtitles, so you can follow along with it, but it requires. I found I was going to have it just in the background at work, but it required a much more focused watch. But I very much enjoyed it, though.
Well, I thought you were going to ask me about the Braun series that just came out on, I guess Hulu here in the States, Disney Plus over in Europe.
Oh yeah,
Keanu
I
Reeves
enjoyed
hosted.
that.
But yeah, that was a very good, very well done production. And I mean, you want to talk about a story that I don't think is ever going to happen again. You
Yeah,
know how all that deal came together, and you know, again, I said it in the opinion piece there. I don't mean to kind of shamelessly plug that here, but
I'll do it.
he Michael met every goal and every expectation. Every time he did, it seemed like the goalposts were being moved. And then finally, you heard that there were 4 new applicants, and Roden was one of them. Maybe promising Jamie Chadwick a drive and trying to get a female driver onto the grid, which I think long term would have been a compelling story as well. But Andretti was the only one of those 4 that got the FIA approval, and even with that, couldn't get the approval from Formula One themselves. And so we'll see. I mean, I to the point where he already has a car in the wind tunnel. It sounds like from the last statements that they put out that they're full steam ahead here. And I don't know I mean, maybe it's going to end up being a blessing in disguise with how awful Alpine looked to start this year, that they're not going to be coming in next year in 26 with the Renault engines, with how dreadful those seem to be right now. And maybe they get the approval ultimately with Cadillac as being a GM works team or whatever. I'm sure the story is far from over here, but the fact that they've made it this far and still are being told no is just, again, I share your disbelief in, like, what is the threat that and again, forget a small team in this case, even Andretti here, like the threat should be, the top teams, make sure you stake your claim as the top teams and go out and beat them. And I think it would be incredibly difficult. I don't envision that Andretti would pull a Braun and start winning races and championships left and right here. I think it would take some time, and I think they know that it would take some time. And yet even then, there's I don't really know what more that they want, because they've been told that there's no guarantee that they're going to be competitive here. And Gunther Steiner really, to me, was the most, just left me in disbelief, was his comments about the whole deal, because he was in the exact same position not quite a decade ago when Haas was trying to come in. And again, I was really just starting to get into Formula One around that time, 2014, 2015. So I don't know how many hoops Haas had to jump through. Obviously not this many, because they ultimately ended up getting that approval there. But again, it's very frustrating to watch that unfold. And for Gunther in particular to hold the opinions that he had, given that Manor was still on the grid at the time, and it was the exact same situation, wanting to come in as the 11th team. And yet Haas got that approval. No disrespect to Haas, but I think, not based on their NASCAR efforts before Tony Stewart came along, not a name that you would associate with motorsports championships and glory nearly as much as you would with Andretti. And yet they got approved a while back, and Andretti can't here in 2024.
Exactly. Exactly. See, yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe sometimes I wonder how much is this just the outsider's perspective versus the business side of it, and operating with these teams and all that. But I mean, as an outsider, not somebody that owns a team or anything like that, I've always found new teams and new drivers to be extremely exciting. I mean, I remember, whether it was I mean, again, mostly in the NASCAR context, and looking at press guides coming out and new paint schemes, new team matchups, and who the rookie class was going to be, and drivers matched up with somebody else, is like, oh, maybe that'll work, or maybe that won't work, or oh, there's a lot of hype with this, but is this going to be a big deal, or is this one that everybody's overlooking? Is that could be the big one? Um, I think that's such an important part of racing in general. I think whatever the series is, I think it's got to be fresh. It's not going to, because otherwise, I mean, if you just have the same people over and over again, and people get bored with that, they really do. It may not seem like it in the short term, and they may have a certain portion of the fan base. They'll be like, oh, I'm just here to see Kyle Larson or whatever, and that's it. And who cares about everybody else? I mean, heck, I remember we all had favorite drivers at one point or another. I feel like I didn't really, I mean, that's kind of in the 500 days series. I feel like I'm enjoying these races in 2001 way more than I did back then, because back then I'd tune in Did Jerry win or not? No, he didn't. Okay, well, moving on to the next one. It's like, no, but there's way more that's happening. You know, and it's somewhere along the way we've lost sight of that in all of motorsports. The fact that the Formula One thing isn't entirely an aberration. I think that's the most shocking element of all, is that, you know, the poor big teams, they need more help, and they need to defend themselves against these interlopers that are coming into the sport. And it's like, no, just let them come in and beat them. You know, if you're that good, these shouldn't be a threat. I've never understood it. I mean, it applies everywhere else in any other business. Why should this be different? I don't believe, I don't believe any team is too big to fail. So, just, I mean, I know that it was, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you're right. It is a discussion for another day with the charters there for sure. I don't want to go too far afield, but I agree. I agree for sure.
Yeah, and well, again, I know there's a number of contributing factors to television ratings, and I mean, again, you want to talk about uncompetitive? How about the same guy, not just the same team, the same individual driver winning 19 of the last 20 races dating back to last year?
Yeah.
And the predictability of that, maybe turning. I mean, I guess it's great if you're a Max Verstappen or Red Bull Racing fan, but you couple that with the insulting denial of Andretti's application to come join the grid. And I think, certainly here in the States, I think the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix numbers just came out today, and they're down significantly. And again, that was a Saturday morning compared to Sunday last year, and on ESPN2, I think, compared to ESPN. So there's a whole number of factors there, and context that's important to note. But I think the future of F1 in the States is going to be very interesting for much the same reasons that, I think a lot of certainly fans of the smaller teams have been kind of disillusioned with the charter system in NASCAR. Is, if the name Andretti, and like I said in the opinion piece, that, if they can't make it onto the grid, how can anyone else? And then, you're really, again, just saying the quiet part out loud there, that, I think they call it the Concord Agreement in Formula One, not the charter system, not an apples to apples comparison there, but, these 10 teams really seem to, have the sport on lock. And again, if not even Andretti can come in, it seems like it's a pretty closed gate there.
Yep. I think that's exactly what they're trying to say. But I mean, I you just can't have stagnation in motorsports. I mean, it's always changing. And I'll say that freely as somebody that, I talk about, the way that, the sport used to be and stuff like that. But even I admitted back in 2019 when I did the video on racing in the 90s, is one of the reasons that era was so good was that we knew it was ending. It was an era that was on the verge of a change, and nobody anticipated it was going to be what happened to Dale Earnhardt in 2001. But the rise of Jeff Gordon, the fact that it was becoming the field against Jeff Gordon, was a change from like the early 90s. I know Rusty Wallace certainly feels that way. He thought he was going to be the guy of the decade. And then, I think, everybody talks about an Earnhardt and Gordon rivalry. I thought the Rusty Wallace Jeff Gordon rivalry was much more engaging back then. But yeah, that's you have to have that. And as much as, maybe you don't want to, lose aspects of the sport that you like, you have to have that ability for change to be in there. I'm glad to an extent we've had that in the Cup Series, even with the charters, because I think it's great that we have Trackhouse and that we have 2311. I just don't like that those omelets required breaking so many eggs to make, that we had to
Yeah.
lose, Ganassi, that we had to lose these other programs, and many that have lost since the charter system started. And I know that, even in the case of Starcom, that they were able to be compensated for that. But we need to be real about this. We need to understand that, when you sell a charter, that's get out and never return, because, how much is it going to cost if you want to buy your way back in? It's going to be more generally. I mean, theoretically it's got a cap somewhere, but I mean, in the short term, like, you're not going to be able to get back in. They're not as a chartered team, and how long do you want to lose money as an open program? I mean, I'm hopeful that BJ McLeod's team is able to do it. I think they've had some actually pretty solid and respectable performances in just the brief times we've seen them, this year on the Cup Series side. But, it's the lack of transparency with the intent in the system there, kind of like with the Andretti deal there for sure, and like as you said, saying the quiet part out loud. That's another part that really gets to me. If they would just be honest and just say, look, we don't want anybody new in here. We want these 10 teams. That's it, period. Just say it. Just say it. I mean, this because
Yeah.
otherwise making everybody waste their time and do all this is crazy. And then but I guess they don't want to say it because maybe they have a legal claim at that point, and who knows what happens there. So, um, but hopefully, I hope that there's going to be some kind of a culture change here at some point where we're going to realize that yeah, I mean maybe in the Cup Series, maybe 36 teams isn't enough, or maybe in Formula One, 10 teams isn't enough, and it's like well we want these guys in there, we want these guys in there. Um, Maybe if there's enough demand for that, that gets revised, and maybe that'll be a sea change in motorsports in general. But I guess right now we're just kind of teetering on this end, and we haven't fallen completely off the deep end, but keeping the Andretti's out of Formula One, I think, is pretty close to being just about
Yeah.
capsized. So hopefully we get back on even keel here pretty soon.
Let's wrap it up here. Obviously, I think we fell down a bit of a rabbit hole with the Andretti's
No
there. I
worries.
mean, you
No,
know that I'm
totally fine.
very passionate about that subject. Why I've written multiple op-eds for the site about that and my feelings there. Just real quick, I want to look ahead to the rest of this year. You just relaunched the website, which again wasn't necessarily a choice that you intended on making going into the off season, but your hand was kind of forced there.
Yeah.
And I understand that when I went back home for this weekend, I guess my old Delaware address is still in the in my PayPal or whatever, so that's where the Patreon letter went. But I saw a confirmation that as of right now, Sonoma or Sears Point, as you still call it, is the only trackside race that you intend on doing at this point at least. I know those plans are subject to change, but
Mhm.
what's 2024 and beyond, I guess, look like for you? I know you said you're not really working on a book right now. You're working more towards the videos and obviously updating the site. What can we expect over the next year or so from LASTCAR.info?
I'm very excited about this year. Yes, I mean you are correct. As of this moment, Sears Point's the only trackside coverage I have planned. I have a second one that may be in the works. We decided not to do Phoenix this year, to in order to kind of free up the possibility. I big part here is just got to save up my vacation hours at work and be a little careful with that because a couple years ago when I did Vegas and Phoenix in the same year, I ran up against the threshold there, and I can't do that again. So I've had to kind of change things up a little bit. But but yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at like this year. And the focus for this year was going to be again trying to just kind of beef up the YouTube channel. I got a number of projects I've had kind of a backlog of, especially since like last August or September, that I'm kind of catching up on. Even these opinion pieces, but kind of been part of that too. So we're just starting to kind of start that wave here, and I'm going to kind of carry that through a lot of this season. So it's not going to be as much of a focus on the trackside one. Certainly, the articles on the website are going to keep going. The last place coverage for the top three series that's not going to change. Um, and but yeah, and then yeah, looking at really kind of returning to do more trackside stuff next year. This was originally going to be the plan last year as well. Those of your viewers that have seen the newsletters from that year, the Patreon as well. That was the plan last year, and then the Cope book kind of took center stage on that, and that became kind of the focus of 2023, which thankfully was completed. But I did have that backlog of the videos kind of stayed through that, and so now that's kind of what I'm working on right now. So I'm very excited about it though. As of right now, actually right now as I'm sitting here, I have the script recorded already for the next episode of 500 Days, episode 8. I hope to have that one. I know I've already edited the outtakes out, but started putting clips in. So I should have that done this month. That's gonna be one. I have another opinion video coming out next week. Those of you that are in the Patreon, patreon.com/lastcar on Brock, $5 and up levels, you'll have advanced access to that. Also took some video from doing some hot laps around Sears Point yesterday. Last Bro was driving my daily driver, my 2014 Altima around there yesterday on the new pavement, and we got some good footage from that. So that'll be on the channel. I have another 3-part video series in the works that I'm hoping to start recording tomorrow, actually, and get that going. So I'm gonna be plenty busy with that. And I think a lot of that's gonna be just the first half of this year. So but yeah, did another driver interview for Rise of the Field Fillers last Saturday. Forgot about that. So that'll be on the Carter Racing team. That'll be the one that was originally scheduled at the Carl Long video came up. Yeah, and just gonna be working on that. So I think this will be a good time to kind of I think you just kind of had two different trends happening at the same time here, and that'll allow more time for the videos on there because I know people have been anxious for that. And that's one thing I've really been trying to work on the channel is just get more regular uploads there because um I look at some of the upload dates and it's just been taking too long. So hopefully this will get there. I think that's at least that's a goal.
Well, they're called JD and Cope. You can go get them on Amazon right now. And
So
of course,
much.
check out Brock's YouTube page with 500 Days and Rise of the Field Fillers and lots of other great videos and content there as well. Brock, is there anything else you want to highlight or plug here before we sign off for the evening?
No, not so much. You covered it great. Thank you again for having me on the show, and again, thank you for your contributions to the site as well. You and William do a great job.
All right. Well, Brock, thank you so much. And again, sorry it's been a while since I did one of these. I was hoping to get you back a lot sooner than we did here, but just between the move and everything, and actually having a day job again and the schedule challenges, I feel the same way about my channel, to be honest. There's a lot of projects that I have in the works that I just, I need to find the time to just sit down and actually start writing some scripts and knocking them out here. So hopefully I can get back into a habit of doing that along with this show here as well. But thanks again for your time tonight, and I'll let you get back to putting the finishing touches on those projects like you were mentioning.
Sure thing. Well, thank you for having me on.